Hey guys, tonight we're stepping into a world of white gloves, calling cards, and social rules so complicated they could make your head spin, and that's before the corset cuts off your circulation. We're talking about the Edwardian era, roughly 1900 to 1910, a time when being a woman of good breeding meant memorising a rule book longer than most people's entire reading lists. And every single rule existed to make sure you never, ever embarrassed yourself in front of people who were already judging you before you walked through the door. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you actually enjoy what I do here. Leave a comment telling me where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It genuinely never gets old seeing where people are listening from at 2 a.m. Oh, and the channel is now on Spotify. Link is in the description, so if you'd like to fall asleep on the go, we've got you covered. Now dim those lights, maybe flip on a fan for that soft white noise, and get yourself properly horizontal. Let's get curious for a second. Have you ever wondered what it was actually like to be an Edwardian woman? Did they ever get to just sit down? Could they breathe? Was every single meal a performance? Did someone actually follow them around with a ruler to check their posture? What happened if you accidentally used the fish fork for the meat course? Were you quietly blacklisted from society forever? And if you sneezed without warning, did that count as a scandal? Congratulations, you've just woken up in 1903. You're a respectable woman of the middle or upper classes. Your waist is approximately the width of a large jam jar. There is a hat the size of a fruit basket pinned to your head, and you have exactly 47 things you're not allowed to do before noon. Good luck. You didn't put on a corset. The corset put itself on you and then made the decisions. From the moment an Edwardian girl was old enough to be considered presentable, sometimes as young as 8 or 9, the corset became a permanent fixture of daily life, not a garment so much as an architectural intervention. The Edwardian silhouette was famous for its distinctive S-bend shape, chest thrust forward, hips pushed back, waist cinched to a measurement that modern medicine would politely describe as a cry for help. Your lady's maid would place you in each morning with the practiced efficiency of someone rigging a sailboat, and the expectation was that you would spend the next 16 hours in this contraption without complaint, because complaining about your corset was naturally unladylike. The corset wasn't a new invention. Women had been wearing them for centuries by the time the Edwardians got their hands on the concept and decided to make things significantly worse. But the Edwardian version had a specific ambition, the S-bend, or health corset as it was, optimistically named by the people selling it. The idea was that by pushing the chest forward and the hips backward, the design actually relieved pressure on the abdomen compared to its predecessors. This was technically true in the same way that jumping from the second floor is technically safer than jumping from the fourth. Progress of a kind. The tight-lacing culture that surrounded the corset operated on a logic that was entirely its own. A waist of 17 or 18 inches was considered ideal in certain circles, though most women settled for something in the low 20s. To put that in perspective, the average modern woman's waist is somewhere around 30 inches, and she's not considered to be in any kind of structural danger. The difference between those measurements was achieved through years of gradual training, starting in childhood with lighter stays and working upward, or rather inward, as the body slowly accepted its new geometry. The physical consequences were not small. Doctors of the era documented cases of displaced organs, compressed ribs, chronic indigestion, and breathing difficulties so commonplace they were essentially considered a standard feature of womanhood rather than a symptom of anything in particular. Fainting was not a dramatic overreaction. It was a predictable physiological response to wearing something that limited your lung capacity to roughly 60% of normal. Women kept smelling salts close at hand not because they were fragile, but because they were wearing their own compression device to every social event they attended. The truly maddening part is that the corset was also a status symbol. A tightly laced waist signalled that you were a woman of sufficient means to have someone else dress you, that you did not perform physical labour, and that you had been raised correctly from girlhood. Working-class women wore corsets too. Almost everyone did, but theirs were looser, more functional, designed for a life that involved actually moving. The elaborate S-bend corset of the fashionable Edwardian lady was, in its own way, a declaration. I cannot do very much in this, and that is rather the point. By the end of the era, reform dress movements were beginning to argue loudly against the whole enterprise. Rational dress advocates pointed out, with the kind of calm fury that comes from having been medically inconvenienced for decades, that women's clothing was actively harming them. The medical establishment slowly and reluctantly agreed. But in the heart of the Edwardian era, those voices were still largely drowned out by the rustle of stiff boning and the quiet, determined sounds of a woman breathing as shallowly as possible and calling it fashion. You wore the corset wore you, and in the morning it all started again. The alarm wasn't a clock, it was a lady's maid standing at the foot of your bed with the quiet patience of someone who had already been awake for 3 hours. For an Edwardian woman of means, the morning routine was less a casual start to the day and more a full theatrical production, with a cast of supporting characters, a wardrobe department, and an unspoken understanding that rushing was vulgar. You did not simply get up, you were assembled. Hair was pinned, skin was powdered, garments were layered in a specific sequence that, if disrupted, could apparently throw the entire social order into question. The lady's maid arrived first with a cup of tea, which you drank in bed, one of the few genuinely pleasant aspects of the entire morning. This was called early morning tea, or in the French tradition adopted by households who wished to sound slightly more refined. The petit déjeuner, though calling it that in the wrong company could be considered affected. You had approximately 15 minutes to lie there in relative peace before the business of the day began, which meant 15 minutes was something you protected fiercely. Then came the hair. Edwardian hairstyles were not simple. The fashionable silhouette of the era required a considerable amount of hair piled on top of the head, in a soft, wide arrangement that sat above a broad-brimmed hat and gave the overall impression of a woman balancing a tasteful cloud on her head. Natural hair, however plentiful, was frequently supplemented with pads, false pieces, and a great deal of strategic pinning. The process took between 30 and 60 minutes depending on the complexity of the style and the skill of your maid, and you sat through it with the resigned stillness of someone being operated on. After the hair came the layers, an Edwardian woman dressed in sequins, first the chemise, then the corset cover, then the petticoats, sometimes 2 or 3, then the skirt, then the bodice, then the belt, then the collar, and finally the cuffs and any decorative additions. This was not a process you could reliably complete alone. The hooks at the back of the bodice alone required assistance, and attempting to lace your own corset to the correct tightness was an exercise in optimism. Interdependence was built into the very architecture of the clothing. This was not accidental. By the time you were fully dressed, something between 45 minutes and an hour and a half had elapsed. You had not yet eaten breakfast, responded to any correspondence, or done anything that might be described as productive. And yet the morning was already in its own way exhausting, a series of small physical indignities absorbed with the cheerful composure expected of a well-raised woman who understood that comfort was a private matter and appearance was a public one. Breakfast followed, and it was substantial by modern standards. Eggs, kippers, cold meats, toast, fruit, more tea. The Edwardians were committed breakfast eaters, operating on the reasonable theory that you needed significant fuel to maintain the performance required of you for the Rest of the day. You ate it in the morning room or the dining room, dressed, pinned and powdered, sitting upright, because a woman who slouched at her own breakfast table had already lost something essential before the day had properly started. The rest of the day was waiting. You had to be ready for it. You were always, in the Edwardian era, already being judged. Visiting someone was not something you simply did. It was something you arranged, planned, performed, and then dissected afterward for hidden meaning. The morning call, which confusingly took place in the afternoon, was one of the most carefully regulated social rituals in the Edwardian world, a choreographed exchange of politeness so precise that first-time participants could be forgiven for thinking they'd accidentally wandered into an elaborate theatrical production. You arrived between 3 and 5 in the afternoon. You stayed between 15 and 20 minutes. You didn't overstay. Overstaying was the social equivalent of standing on the dining table. The name morning call was inherited from an earlier era when fashionable society operated on a schedule shifted significantly later than ordinary working life. Morning simply meant before the evening's main events, which began around 8 or 9. By the Edwardian period, the name had stopped making logical sense, but nobody changed it because changing it would have required acknowledging that it had never made sense, which was the kind of observation that got you labelled tiresome. You arrived at the door of the house you were calling upon, gave your card to the butler or the footman, and waited to be admitted. If the lady of the house was not receiving, a phrase that meant exactly what it said, she had simply decided not to see anyone that day. For any reason, or no reason at all, you left your card and departed, no feelings to be hurt, no explanation required. The ritual acknowledged elegantly that sometimes people needed a socially acceptable way of being unavailable, and the morning call provided one without requiring anyone to pretend illness or manufacture an excuse. If you were admitted, you were shown to the drawing room, where you sat correctly at the front of the chair, spine upright, and engaged in conversation for the prescribed duration. The conversation itself had rules. You inquired after health in general terms. You remarked on recent social events you had both attended or were both likely to attend. You might discuss the weather, a new exhibition, or a recent musical performance, though nothing too opinionated, because strong opinions delivered during a morning call had a way of circulating through a neighbourhood with uncomfortable speed. At around 15 minutes, an attentive hostess would begin the subtle signals that indicated the call was drawing to its natural conclusion. She might glance briefly at the clock, shift slightly in her seat, or simply allow a small pause to develop in the conversation that a socially fluent guest would recognise and fill with the beginning of her departure. You stood, collected your gloves, expressed your thanks with the correct degree of warmth, and left. The whole thing was over in the time it takes to watch a television episode, and yet it had accomplished something. Social contact had been made, the relationship had been maintained, and both parties had demonstrated their fitness for polite society. That was, in the end, the entire point. Getting the call wrong was surprisingly easy. Arriving too early suggested eagerness, which was almost as bad as being late, which suggested disrespect. Talking too much made you seem nervous or ill-bred. Talking too little made you seem cold or superior. And if you left too abruptly, the hostess would spend the next 3 days wondering what she had done to offend you, and word would spread accordingly. The morning call was a 15-minute window in which a great deal could go wrong, and everyone involved knew it. That was why you practiced, prepared, and never, under any circumstances, arrived without your cards. Before there was a profile to visit or a message to send, there was the calling card, a small engraved rectangle of stiff cardstock that carried more social weight than most people's entire personalities. Leaving a card was not merely a nicety, it was a statement of intention, a coded message, and a permanent record of your social standing all at once. The way you left your card, where you bent the corner, whether you came in person or sent a servant, whether you dog-eared the top left or the bottom right, all of it meant something specific, and getting it wrong meant telegraphing your ignorance to people who collected ignorance like stamps. The card itself communicated before you even bent a corner. The typeface mattered. Engraved lettering was correct. Printed lettering was acceptable in a pinch, and anything that looked as though it had been produced cheaply was a quiet catastrophe. The size mattered. A lady's card was larger than a gentleman's, which seems backwards until you understand that the lady's card was meant to be left by itself, while the gentleman's was often left alongside his wife's, tucked underneath or beside it according to the household being visited. The quality of the cardstock mattered. The thickness of the paper mattered. People held your card in their hands and formed an impression of you before they had said a single word in your direction, and that impression was difficult to revise. The corner-bending system added a layer of meaning that functioned like a primitive notification system. Folding the top right corner meant you had delivered the card in person rather than sending a servant, a mark of genuine courtesy. Folding the bottom corner signalled congratulations. Folding the top left corner meant you were offering condolences. There were regional variations, household variations, and generational variations in precisely what each fold communicated, which meant that a card folded with the purest intentions could occasionally be received as something else entirely, and cause a minor social incident that nobody could explain without producing the card as evidence. You kept your own cards in a small silver or leather case, carried at all times, because running out of cards in a situation that called for one was embarrassing, in a way that was difficult to recover from gracefully. The card case itself was another object subject to aesthetic judgment. Plain and good quality was correct, overly decorative was showy, and visibly worn was unacceptable regardless of the sentimental attachment you might have to it. Receiving cards was its own procedure. A proper household kept a silver tray in the entrance hall specifically for this purpose, and a card left on a wooden surface, or, worse, handed directly to the hostess without going through the correct channels suggested that either the visitor or the household was operating below the expected standard. Cards received were stored, noted, and responded to, because failing to return a call within a reasonable period was a statement, whether you intended it as one or not. In the Edwardian social ecosystem, silence was never simply silence. It was information. The calling card was the mechanism by which that information travelled, and every woman who understood the system knew that a small rectangle of engraved paper could, in the right hands, accomplish nearly anything. There was no such thing as an outfit that worked for more than one occasion. The Edwardian woman didn't own a wardrobe so much as she maintained a costume department, organised by the hour and occasion with the precision of a military campaign. Morning dress was for mornings. Afternoon dress was for afternoons. Visiting dress was for visiting. Garden party dress was for garden parties. Tea gown, a floaty, semi-respectable garment that allowed slightly loosened lacing, was for that sacred private hour before dinner when a woman might, if she was lucky, breathe at a volume slightly above a whisper. The logic behind the system was not entirely without reason, in the way that most deeply irrational things contain, if you squint at them long enough, a faint thread of original sense. Different parts of the day genuinely did require different things. Morning activities were more domestic and physical, afternoons were social, evenings were formal. The problem was that each category had been subdivided to a degree that required most upper-class women to change their clothes between 3 and 5 times a day, which was time-consuming, physically demanding, and required the ongoing assistance of at least one other person at almost every transition. Morning dress was relatively plain, lighter colours, simpler fabrics, less ornamentation, designed for writing letters, managing household accounts, and conducting the domestic business of the day. It was still structured, still corseted, still entirely unsuitable for anything that involved bending, lifting, or moving at pace. But it was considered the casual end of the spectrum, which tells you everything you need to know about the spectrum. A woman who received an unexpected caller while still in her morning dress after noon was considered faintly underprepared, and she knew it, and the caller knew it, and both of them pretended otherwise with a determination that was itself a kind of social skill. Afternoon dress was where things escalated. This was what you wore for calling, for being called upon, for shopping in the better establishments, and for the 1,000 small social transactions that filled the middle portion of the Edwardian day. Afternoon dress was more decorated, more carefully considered, and expected to hold up to the scrutiny of people who were paying attention. The colours were deeper, the fabrics were richer, and the detailing, lace at the collar, embroidery on the cuff, a carefully chosen brooch at the throat communicated that you were dressed with intention for whoever might encounter you. Evening dress was another realm entirely. Décolletage appeared, which was not permitted at any other hour regardless of the temperature. Long gloves arrived. Jewellery emerged from its boxes. The hair was rearranged, the accessories reconsidered, and by the time dinner was served, a woman who had been sitting at her writing desk that morning had been effectively transformed into an entirely different visual presentation of herself. The clothes were not just clothes. They were a signal system, broadcasting your status, your understanding of social norms, and your willingness to do the considerable work required to maintain appearances at every hour of the day. Running out of appropriate things to wear was not a wardrobe problem, it was a social crisis. No item in the Edwardian woman's wardrobe was more aggressively committed to being noticed than the hat. By the early 1900s, hats had entered a new era of architectural ambition, wide-brimmed, towering, and in some cases so heavily decorated with feathers, fruit, flowers, and stuffed birds that the milliner and the taxidermist were practically the same person. You did not simply wear a hat. You secured it to your hair with pins long enough to function as weapons, tilted it at the precise fashionable angle, and then attempted to move through the world without decapitating anyone seated nearby. The Edwardian hat was not a small thing. The wide-brimmed styles, fashionable in the early part of the era, could measure 18 inches or more across, which is roughly the diameter of a medium pizza. If you've ever tried to move a medium pizza through a doorway at an angle, while dressed formally and surrounded by people forming opinions about you, the hat had to balance on a considerable upswept hairstyle, which meant that before the hat could be pinned, the hair had to be constructed to a sufficient height and width to provide a stable base. You were essentially building a platform in order to build a structure on top of the platform, and both had to survive the afternoon. Hat pins were the engineering solution, and they were extraordinary objects. Long, sometimes 8 or 10 inches, with decorative heads of glass, jet, or precious stone, and points sharp enough to draw blood if mishandled. They were driven through the hat and into the hair, at precise angles calculated to distribute weight and resist movement, and a woman skilled at pinning her own hat could achieve a stability that would survive a moderate breeze with dignity. What hat pins also achieved, and this was not entirely unnoticed by the women wearing them, was a personal defence weapon of considerable reliability. There are documented accounts of Edwardian women using their hat pins to discourage unwanted male attention on public transport, which suggests that the era was perhaps more practical than it sometimes appeared. The decorations on the hats were a world unto themselves. Ostrich feathers were fashionable and expensive. Egret feathers were even more fashionable and even more expensive. Whole birds, mounted, preserved, and wired into naturalistic poses, appeared on hats throughout the 1890s and into the early 1900s, with a frequency that eventually prompted the formation of the Royal Society for the Protection of Birds, whose founders had apparently attended one too many garden parties. Artificial flowers, ribbons, veiling, fruit, and geometric ornaments of velvet and wire completed the available vocabulary. A hat was a statement, a season's worth of fashion news compressed into a single object balanced above your face and secured by something that was technically a weapon. Going out without a hat was not done. Not in town, not in the country, not to church, not anywhere that other people might see you. The hat was not optional. The hat was the final piece of the public self, the punctuation mark at the end of the sentence that was your appearance, and without it the whole thing was simply unfinished. You pinned it, you tilted it, you stepped out into the world wearing your architectural achievement, and you moved through it carefully because the hat had its own centre of gravity and occasionally its own ideas about direction. Sitting down, you would think, is one of the things human beings are reasonably good at. You bend at the knee, lower yourself onto a surface and stop moving. Simple. Not in the Edwardian era. Sitting was a skill requiring practice, discipline, and apparently a working knowledge of geometry. You sat at the front of the chair, never the back, which implied laziness and possibly moral failure. You kept your spine upright, your ankles crossed, your hands folded in your lap, and your knees pressed together with the kind of determination usually reserved for enduring very bad news. The corset assisted with this, in the way that a plaster cast assists with keeping a broken limb straight, not through your own effort so much as through structural enforcement. A properly laced Edwardian corset made slouching physically difficult, which was, according to its proponents, one of its benefits. The back stayed straight because the boning held it straight. The chest stayed forward because the boning pushed it forward. You weren't sitting correctly so much as being held in a sitting position by a garment doing most of the work, which raises interesting questions about whether the virtue being demonstrated was yours or your corset's. But even with the corset doing its share, posture was considered a matter of character. Young girls were trained from early childhood using a variety of methods designed to instill the correct physical habits before bad ones could take root. Backboards, rigid flat boards strapped to the back, were used in some households and schools to train the spine into uprightness. Walking with books balanced on the head was a standard exercise. Sitting lessons involved being observed by a governess and corrected, sometimes with a sharp tap to the shoulder blades, whenever a deviation from the ideal occurred. By the time an Edwardian girl reached social circulation, she had spent years being physically shaped into someone who sat correctly without conscious effort. The rules extended beyond the spine. You did not cross your legs, ankles could be crossed, but placing one knee over the other was considered unrefined and in some contexts rather shocking. You did not lean on armrests unless you were elderly or unwell and had a reasonable excuse. You did not fidget, which was considered a sign of either poor breeding or agitation, both of which were equally undesirable. Your hands rested quietly in your lap or occupied themselves with needlework if a project was present and socially appropriate to the occasion. Rising from a chair required as much care as sitting down. You did not push yourself up with your hands. You did not rock forward before standing. You rose in a single smooth motion, which with a full petticoat, a long skirt and a tightly laced corset was considerably more challenging than it sounds, and required a kind of core strength that the era simultaneously demanded and pretended was effortless. The overall effect, when executed correctly, was of someone who existed slightly above the ordinary physical rules governing human movement, serene, controlled, apparently unaffected by gravity in the way that lesser people were. That was the goal. You were not sitting. You were demonstrating in seated form that you had been raised correctly. Dinner was not a meal. Dinner was a formal examination disguised as a meal, administered weekly and attended by people who were absolutely taking notes. The Edwardian dinner table operated according to a set of rules so intricate that entire books were published to help people navigate them, and those books had to be updated regularly because things kept changing. There was the question of which fork to use, and there were many forks, each assigned a specific course, each positioned with intent. There was the question of how to hold your soup spoon, which direction to tilt the bowl, and what to do if the food being served was something you had never encountered before, and were now committed to eating anyway, with an expression of serene familiarity. The formal Edwardian dinner could run to 8 or 10 courses, which meant that the table was set with enough silverware to confuse anyone who hadn't spent years memorizing the sequence. The rule, as every etiquette guide patiently explained, was to begin with the outermost implement and work inward toward the plate with each successive course. This was tidy in theory. In practice, it required you to correctly count how many courses were coming, remember which fork went with which, and execute the correct choice, under the mild social pressure of a table full of people doing exactly the same thing while pretending they weren't thinking about it at all. Soup was its own small ordeal. You tilted the bowl away from you before spooning. Tilting toward yourself was wrong, and the person who noticed would remember, and you sipped from the side of the spoon, never the tip. You did not blow on your soup to cool it. You did not slurp, obviously, but you also did not make any sound that could be described as enthusiastic. If the soup was too hot, you waited in silence while it cooled, maintaining an expression suggesting the temperature situation was entirely within your control and you had simply chosen to pause. The question of conversation at table operated alongside all of this. You spoke to the person on your right during the first part of dinner and to the person on your left for the second, a rotation managed by the hostess, who would signal the turn with a slight shift of her own attention. You did not monopolize, you did not fall into private conversations so deep that the rest of the table felt excluded, and you did not allow a silence to develop that lasted long enough to become uncomfortable. You fed yourself, navigated several simultaneous social relationships, remembered which glass was for which wine, and did all of it while sitting perfectly upright in a corset, without appearing to exert any effort whatsoever. Dinner was the Edwardian era in miniature, a performance of ease that required an enormous amount of invisible work, and the better you were at it, the less anyone would ever know what it cost you. The moment you returned home from any social engagement of note, a dinner, a weekend party, a tea, the clock started ticking. You had approximately 24 hours to produce a handwritten thank you letter of sufficient warmth, sufficient length, and sufficient elegance to demonstrate that you had enjoyed yourself without appearing desperate, were grateful, without appearing fawning, and had retained enough composure during the event itself to remember specific pleasant details to reference. Failure to produce this letter in time was a social transgression that could follow you for seasons. The letter had to be handwritten. This was non-negotiable, and remained so long after alternatives technically existed, because handwriting communicated effort, and effort communicated respect. The hand itself was subject to scrutiny. A clear, well-formed script indicated education and self-discipline, while a hasty or irregular hand suggested the letter had been dashed off without proper consideration, which defeated the entire purpose. You did not type. You did not dictate. You sat at your writing desk, which every respectable household maintained as a dedicated piece of furniture, took out your correct notepaper, and applied yourself. The content had to strike a balance that could reasonably be described as one of the more delicate literary challenges available to a non-professional writer. Too brief, and you seemed indifferent. You had attended the event, eaten the food, enjoyed the company, and could not produce more than 3 lines in response, which implied that very little had impressed you. Too long, and you seemed excessive, gushing over the flower arrangements and the quality of the claret in paragraph after paragraph, until your hostess began to wonder if you had nothing better to do, which was its own kind of insult. The ideal letter was warm, specific, composed in good prose, and occupied approximately one side of a sheet of notepaper. The specific details were what separated a perfunctory thank you from a genuine one. You referenced something real, the quality of a particular dish, the pleasure of meeting a specific guest, an amusing moment in the evening's conversation. This proved you'd been present, attentive, and engaged, rather than simply enduring the evening on your best behaviour while waiting for a reasonable hour to request your carriage. It proved, in short, that the invitation had been worth extending, which was ultimately the reassurance the hostess was looking for. The letter was posted the following morning without fail. Ladies in well-organised Edwardian households had a system. Correspondence was answered at a specific time of day, the outgoing post was dispatched at a specific hour, and the whole operation functioned with a regularity that would have impressed a postal service. A letter that arrived 2 days late told a story. You had been busy, you had been disorganised, or you had not considered the matter sufficiently important to prioritise. None of those stories were flattering. You wrote the letter, you sent the letter, and somewhere across town your hostess received it, read it, and formed her conclusions. That was simply how the world worked. Gloves were not an accessory. They were armour, protocol, and social insurance all stitched into a single garment, and the rules governing when you could and could not remove them were numerous enough to warrant their own pamphlet. You wore gloves outdoors always. You wore gloves when calling. You wore gloves to church. You wore long gloves to evening events, and short gloves to afternoon events, and mixing them up, showing up to a formal dinner in afternoon-length gloves, was the kind of mistake that people would remember for an unreasonable amount of time. The glove served several purposes at once, which is part of why the rules around it were so layered. It was a hygienic barrier, hands touched many things, and in the Edwardian social world, bare hands touching other bare hands was a relatively intimate contact that occurred only in specific sanctioned circumstances. The glove mediated all other contact, allowing the handshake to happen without the immediate physical reality of skin. It was a mark of social status. A well-fitted glove in fine kid leather was expensive, and its quality communicated something about the household that produced it. And it was a signal of awareness. Wearing the correct glove for the occasion demonstrated that you knew the rules, which was in itself a recommendation. Button gloves were the most formal variety, fastening at the wrist or the forearm with a series of small pearl or horn buttons that required a button hook to manage and some patience to manage correctly. Longer evening gloves reached above the elbow and were worn with sleeveless or short-sleeved evening gowns, adding a smoothness of line that the era found elegant. The buttons on these were a production, counted in multiples of 4 in the glove trade, so that a 16-button glove reached approximately mid-forearm and a 24-button reached above the elbow, and knowing the difference mattered when you were ordering them and when you were wearing them. At dinner, the glove situation required a specific navigation. You removed your gloves to eat. This was correct and expected, but you did not simply pull them off and set them on the table. You removed them carefully, folded or rolled them neatly, and placed them in your lap or, in some households, to the side of your place setting, where they sat in dignified retirement until the meal concluded and you replaced them. Leaving your gloves on the table in a haphazard way was the kind of small visual disorder that a watchful hostess would notice and file away. Outdoors, removing your gloves in public, to examine something in a shop, to count coins, to deal with a minor physical inconvenience, was at minimum mildly awkward, and in some contexts actively frowned upon. Bare hands in public suggested either urgency or carelessness, and neither was ideal. You kept your gloves on. You found ways to accomplish things while wearing them. You developed, over years of practice, a gloved dexterity that allowed you to manage most tasks without ever exposing your hands to the open air, which was itself, in its own small way, a kind of skill that the era demanded and then pretended had always been easy. Posture was not a suggestion, it was a moral statement. The way an Edwardian woman moved through a room communicated her breeding, her upbringing, her values, and her general fitness for polite society. all before she opened her mouth. Slouching suggested weakness, or worse, laziness. Walking too quickly suggested agitation. Walking too slowly suggested you were making a scene. The ideal pace was purposeful but unhurried, like someone who had somewhere important to be but had decided in advance not to appear rushed about it. The training began early. A girl who slouched was corrected. A girl who ran was reprimanded. A girl who swung her arms too widely or took steps that were too large was reminded that physical exuberance, while perhaps charming in small children, was not a quality that translated well into adult social life. By the time she was old enough to enter drawing rooms and attend dinner parties, the correct walk had been so thoroughly practiced that it no longer felt like a performance. It simply felt like moving, the way any ingrained habit eventually stops announcing itself and just becomes the default. The mechanics of the Edwardian walk were shaped in part by the clothing itself. A long skirt with slight train or a narrow hem required a specific kind of step, smaller than natural, slightly inward, generating a forward momentum that moved the skirt smoothly rather than catching it or causing it to swing. Too wide a stride and the skirt bunched awkwardly at the front or twisted at the hem. Too short a stride and you moved in tiny shuffling increments that looked, at best, tentative. The correct step split the difference, controlled, fluid, unhurried, producing the gliding effect that period observers described admiringly, and that was achieved through years of practice and a permanent minor restriction of natural movement. Outdoors, additional considerations applied. Cobblestones, gravel paths, and uneven pavements required attention that could not be allowed to show on your face, because looking down at your feet was considered ungainly. You navigated the terrain by feel, by familiarity, and by a kind of studied peripheral awareness that kept your chin level and your gaze forward regardless of what your feet were doing. In wet weather, the skirt had to be lifted slightly with one hand, the correct hand, held at the correct height, with the correct amount of fabric gathered. And this too had rules, because lifting your skirt too high to avoid a puddle was considered immodest, and getting the hem wet was considered careless, and there was apparently no middle ground that pleased everyone simultaneously. In a crowded room, the walk became a navigation exercise with social consequences. You did not push through people. You did not squeeze past in a way that involved physical contact with strangers. You waited for gaps to open, you moved through them smoothly, and you arrived at your destination without any visible evidence of the mild obstacle course you had just completed. If someone was in your path, you adjusted your route so subtly that the adjustment itself was invisible, because requiring others to move for you unless you were of significantly higher social standing was considered presumptuous. The truth underneath all of this is that Edwardian women were extraordinarily physically capable in ways that the era consistently refused to acknowledge. Managing yards of fabric, navigating social spaces, maintaining perfect posture for 16 hours, and moving through the world with the appearance of effortless grace required balance, strength, spatial awareness, and an almost athletic level of physical control. The era dressed all of that up as natural femininity and pretended it had nothing to do with work. It had everything to do with work. The women knew it. They simply weren't allowed to say so. Polite conversation in the Edwardian era operated on the principle that most of life's most interesting subjects were entirely off the table, and the remaining topics had to be navigated with such care that small talk became its own exhausting art form. You did not discuss money, not the presence of it, the absence of it, or the specifics of anyone else's. You did not discuss illness beyond a very brief and tasteful acknowledgement. You did not discuss religion or politics unless you were in an established trusted circle. And even then you softened everything with so many qualifications that your original point became indistinguishable from its opposite. The prohibition on money was perhaps the most structurally absurd of the conversational rules, given that money was the invisible engine running almost every social interaction in the room. Who was invited, what they were wearing, where they lived, whom they were likely to marry, all of it was downstream of financial reality, and everyone in the room knew it, and nobody was allowed to say so. You could imply wealth through your surroundings, your clothing, your address, and the quality of your entertainments. You could not discuss it. Asking someone what something cost was the kind of question that produced a silence so thick you could feel it pressing against the curtains. Illness occupied a similarly narrow conversational corridor. You could inquire after someone's health in general terms, "How are you keeping? I do hope you are well," and receive a general answer in return. Specifics were not welcome. A woman who described her symptoms in any detail, who referenced her doctor's instructions or the duration of her recovery, had crossed into territory that polite company found uncomfortable, partly because illness was considered somewhat private, and partly because it reminded everyone in the room that their bodies were unreliable, which was the kind of thought that had no useful place at a dinner party. The weather remained one of the few genuinely safe topics, which is why the English relationship with meteorological conversation developed into something almost philosophical. Discussing the weather was not a failure of imagination. It was a shared neutral ground where two people could establish conversational contact without risking anything, and in a social world where almost every other topic carried potential hazards, neutral ground was genuinely valuable. You could also discuss travel, in general terms. Recent entertainments, concerts, exhibitions, theatrical performances provided another lane, though strong opinions about art or music had to be expressed carefully, since strong opinions of any kind could mark you as intense, which was not a compliment. What this meant in practice was that an Edwardian woman at a social gathering was engaged in a constant background process of topic assessment, gauging the room, reading her conversation partner, calculating what was safe, what was interesting, and what occupied the narrow intersection of those two things. It was a form of real-time editing, continuous and invisible, applied to everything she said before she said it. The result, when executed skillfully, sounded like natural, pleasant conversation. The result, when you consider what it required, was closer to a sustained performance of spontaneity delivered under significant constraint. The women who were brilliant at this, and there were many, developed a conversational dexterity that could steer almost any subject back to safety without the other person noticing the redirection. They could introduce a new topic so smoothly that it seemed to arise organically from the one that had just become dangerous. They could absorb a conversational mistake made by someone else and dissolve it into the general flow before it had time to settle. It was a skill the era never officially acknowledged as a skill, because acknowledging it would have meant admitting how much invisible work the women in the room were doing just to keep things pleasant. If the daily requirements of Edwardian social life were a marathon, the country house weekend was the marathon with extra hills and no water stations. Arriving at someone's estate for a Friday to Monday gathering meant committing to a schedule that would have impressed a military general. Breakfast at a specific hour, morning activities in specific dress, lunch, afternoon outings, tea, time to change, dinner, and then the evening's entertainment. All of it governed by customs you were expected to know without being told, because asking was embarrassing and not knowing was worse. You arrived on Friday afternoon, usually by train, with a quantity of luggage that would today require its own zip code. The wardrobe requirements for a country house weekend were extensive. A travelling outfit for arrival, a tea gown for Friday afternoon, a dinner dress for Friday evening, a morning dress for Saturday, suitable outfit for whatever outdoor activity was planned, shooting, walking, croquet, an afternoon dress, another dinner dress, a dress for Sunday church, and a travelling outfit for departure. This was not considered excessive. This was considered the minimum. Your lady's maid travelled with you to manage all of it, which meant that your visit to someone else's house involved bringing a person whose entire job was keeping you correctly dressed for each of the 8 daily costume changes. The house itself was a social environment with geography. Where you sat at dinner communicated your standing. Placement was managed by the hostess with considerable care and occasionally considerable diplomacy, since seating a person too far down the table from where they believed they should sit was a slight that could sour the entire weekend. Where you were assigned to sleep communicated something similar. A bedroom near the family rooms was a mark of favour. A room at the distant end of a corridor was not, and the guests quietly noted their own locations and each other's. Mornings were organised around outdoor activities in which participation was expected, but enthusiasm had to be calibrated. Shooting parties were common, and while women did not typically shoot, they were expected to be present, appropriately dressed, and pleasantly engaged with the proceedings. If you were not interested in standing in a field watching men shoot birds, you kept that opinion entirely to yourself and found something genuinely pleasant to observe, because a woman who made her boredom visible was a woman who made her hostess look bad. Croquet, archery, and lawn tennis were more mixed pursuits and carried their own competitive atmosphere that had to be navigated without winning too aggressively or losing too obviously. Evenings were the main event. Dinner was elaborate, extended, and followed by whatever entertainment the house had arranged, charades, cards, music, or simply the drawing, room conversation that continued late into the night for those with the stamina. Going to bed too early suggested either illness or antisocial tendencies. Staying up too late suggested a lack of self-regulation. You calibrated your retirement carefully, excusing yourself at a point that communicated you had enjoyed the evening thoroughly and were withdrawing from it only because you were a person of sensible habits. And then you rose the next morning and did it all again, dressed correctly from breakfast onward, performing the same sustained pleasantness for another full day before the carriages arrived on Monday to take everyone home, where you could finally stop smiling quite so consistently. The Edwardian woman was surrounded by a rich secondary vocabulary made entirely of objects. Flowers carried meaning, a red rose said one thing, a white carnation said another, and arriving somewhere with the wrong flowers at the wrong season meant something that could be interpreted in 6 unflattering ways. Fans were a language unto themselves, particularly in the previous Victorian era, but still lingering in Edwardian social circles. An open fan meant something, a closed one meant something else. Fanning yourself quickly communicated a sentiment you were not permitted to say aloud. The language of flowers, choreography, as it was formerly known, had been codified throughout the Victorian era into elaborate dictionaries that assigned specific meanings to hundreds of plants and blooms. Red roses meant romantic love, which was well known. White roses meant purity or silence. Yellow roses, rather unkindly, had become associated with jealousy or fading affection, which meant that gifting yellow roses to someone who didn't know this was a potential social disaster, and gifting them to someone who did was a statement. Ivy meant fidelity. Forget-me-nots meant exactly what they said. The system was charming in theory and a minefield in practice, since the same flower could mean different things in different reference books, and giving someone a carefully selected bouquet only to discover they were using a different edition of the floral dictionary was the kind of miscommunication that could circulate as a story for years. The fan had evolved over the previous century into something more elaborate than a cooling device, particularly in warmer climates and heated ballrooms where it remained genuinely useful. But the fan language that circulated in etiquette manuals and romantic literature had taken on a life of its own, becoming a semi-formalized system for communicating things that could not be said aloud in mixed company. Fanning quickly indicated agitation or interest. Fanning slowly suggested indifference. Touching the fan to the left cheek meant one thing, to the right cheek meant another, and drawing it across the forehead was apparently a warning signal of some kind. The specifics varied by source, which rather undermined the system's reliability as a communication tool but did nothing to diminish its romantic appeal. Handkerchiefs operated in a similar register. Dropping a handkerchief could be accidental or could be a signal, and the ambiguity was in some ways the point. It provided a degree of deniability that direct communication did not. Whether you had dropped it on purpose was a question only you could answer, and the person who retrieved it for you had to make their own assessment of the situation. The handkerchief held to the lips suggested a secret. The handkerchief twisted in the hand suggested nervousness. All of this gave a woman in a room full of conversational restrictions a secondary channel of expression that operated just below the threshold of what could be officially acknowledged. What is striking about the whole system is how much communicative energy it represents. A civilization of women who had been told they could not say most things directly, and who had therefore developed an entire, parallel vocabulary of objects, gestures, and carefully deployed silences. The fan, the flower, the folded card corner, the positioned handkerchief, all of it was a workaround, an ingenious set of adaptations to a social environment that restricted direct expression. That the adaptations were beautiful, elaborate, and in some cases genuinely poetic does not change what they were. The communication strategies of people who had been handed a very limited set of official channels and had simply built more. An unmarried woman in the Edwardian era did not go places alone. Not to a park, not to a shop, not on a walk in daylight within sight of at least 3 other respectable people. She required a chaperone, a designated older woman whose job was to accompany her everywhere and serve as a kind of human seal of moral approval. The chaperone was not optional. She was not a suggestion. She was a requirement as binding as the corset, and arguably producing the same level of restricted movement, though in a social rather than physical sense. The chaperone system rested on a set of assumptions that were simultaneously practical and insulting. The practical reasoning was that an unmarried woman seen alone with a man, or in any ambiguous situation, was vulnerable to speculation, and speculation, once started, was nearly impossible to stop, and could damage a woman's reputation, and therefore her marriage prospects, in ways that were permanent and severe. The chaperone prevented the situation from arising. She was a visible third party whose presence transformed a potentially compromising encounter into an unimpeachable one, because nothing problematic could be alleged to have happened in front of a respectable older woman who had been watching the entire time. The insult embedded in the system was the implicit suggestion that the unmarried woman herself could not be trusted to manage her own behaviour without supervision, or that her trustworthiness was irrelevant because other people's interpretations of her behaviour were what actually mattered. Both of these were, in their different ways, accurate descriptions of the situation as the era understood it. A woman's reputation was not fully her own. It was a collective assessment made by the people around her, and it could be damaged by circumstances entirely outside her control. The chaperone was the mechanism designed to prevent those circumstances from arising, regardless of what the woman herself would or would not have done. The role of the chaperone was not a coveted one. It required the older woman, typically a married aunt, an older sister, or a family friend of appropriate standing, to be present at all the same social events, to accompany the younger woman on all calls and outings, to wait while she danced and conversed and navigated the social season, and to maintain vigilant awareness of the situation without appearing to surveil, because a chaperone who was too obviously watchful made the younger woman look suspected rather than protected. It was a delicate balance that required considerable social skill and, frankly, a degree of endurance. By the later Edwardian years, the system was beginning to soften around the edges. Bicycles had done some of the early work, A woman on a bicycle could travel independently in a way that made constant chaperonage logistically awkward, and the bicycle had been widely adopted before anyone fully worked out the social implications. Department stores had created semi-public spaces where women could spend time unaccompanied without it meaning anything alarming. The telephone had made it possible to arrange meetings and conversations without physical proximity. The world was changing in ways that made the rigid chaperone system increasingly impractical, and the women living through those changes were, quietly and without announcing it, testing the edges of what the new arrangements permitted. The chaperone was on her way out, she just didn't know it yet. Accepting a compliment gracefully was one of the more technically demanding requirements of Edwardian womanhood, and it involved threading a needle so thin that most women just spent their whole lives slightly flustered. You could not simply say thank you, too direct, too confident, borderline aggressive in its simplicity. You could not deflect too dramatically, that verged on false modesty, which was vulgar in its own specific way. The correct response occupied a precise emotional register, somewhere between genuine gratitude and serene indifference, delivered with a soft smile and a small remark that acknowledged the compliment without lingering on it. The prohibition on direct self-praise was total and absolute. You did not agree with a compliment about your appearance. Agreeing implied that you had noticed your own appearance and found it satisfactory, which suggested vanity, which was a serious charge. You did not agree with a compliment about your accomplishments. Agreeing implied that you considered yourself accomplished, which suggested arrogance, which was worse. The correct move was to deflect the credit gently outward, to your dressmaker, if the compliment concerned your gown, to your music teacher, if it concerned your playing, to the quality of the ingredients, if someone praised something you had cooked or arranged. You were a conduit for other people's good work. You were not officially the source of anything particularly impressive. This created a curious dynamic in which everyone in the room knew that the woman being complimented had in fact chosen her gown, practiced her music and arranged her flowers, and the woman receiving the compliment knew that everyone knew, and everyone was nevertheless collectively committed to the fiction that she had very little to do with any of it. The performance of modesty was so thoroughly understood as a performance that it had ceased to fool anyone while remaining entirely mandatory. You did it anyway, because the alternative, actually taking credit, was not available. Giving compliments had its own set of requirements. A compliment that was too lavish seemed insincere. A compliment that was too specific seemed as though you'd been staring, which was uncomfortable. A compliment on appearance was generally acceptable within certain limits. Remarking favourably on a woman's gown was safe. Remarking on her figure was not, regardless of the spirit in which it was intended. Complimenting someone's intelligence directly could be read as surprise that they possessed it, which was more insult than praise. The safest compliments were warm, general, and directed at things the recipient had chosen: a well-run household, a beautifully arranged table, an elegant piece of needlework, because these acknowledged effort and taste without venturing into the complicated territory of personal qualities. The whole system was, in its own way, a form of social maintenance. Compliments circulated through Edwardian social life as a kind of currency, offered, received, and returned in cycles that reinforced relationships and communicated goodwill. Getting the exchange right meant you were someone who could be trusted to behave correctly in delicate situations. Getting it wrong, accepting too eagerly, deflecting too dramatically, offering something that accidentally landed as criticism, marked you as someone whose social calibration was slightly off. And in a world where social calibration was everything, slightly off was a problem that lingered considerably longer than the original conversation. The Edwardian era had a complicated relationship with women's health, which is a diplomatic way of saying that most of what women experienced was either dismissed as nerves, attributed to their corsets, or both. If you were unwell, you were expected to be unwell quietly and with as little disruption to your household as possible. Taking to your bed was permitted under specific circumstances, genuine, undeniable illness, or the vaguer but socially accepted category of nervous exhaustion, which covered everything from genuine anxiety to simply being finished with a particularly demanding social season. The nervous system was the era's preferred explanation for almost anything a woman experienced that didn't have an obvious physical cause, and quite a few things that did. Headaches were nerves, fatigue was nerves, sadness, irritability, difficulty concentrating, sleeplessness, all of it filtered through the same diagnostic category, which was simultaneously a way of acknowledging that something was wrong and a way of declining to investigate what that something actually was. The treatment was typically rest, fresh air, removal from stimulation, and perhaps a tonic, a bottle of something that might contain iron, or might contain something considerably stronger, since patent medicines of the era operated with a freedom of formulation that modern pharmacy would find alarming. The spa town and the rescue were the serious medical responses to nervous exhaustion, and for women of sufficient means, a season at Bath or Harrogate or one of the continental resorts was a legitimate prescription. You went, you took the waters, you rested, you were excused from the social calendar for the duration, and you returned restored. The rest cure prescribed by some physicians was more extreme: complete bed rest, isolation from stimulation including reading and conversation, which sounds less like a treatment and more like a punishment, and which was experienced by many of the women who underwent it in exactly those terms. What the era consistently failed to examine was the degree to which the life it required of women was itself a significant contributor to the exhaustion being treated. A woman who spent her days corseted, her evenings performing, her mornings managing a household, her afternoons maintaining social relationships, and her letters conducting the written correspondence of an entire family's social life, was not suffering from a mysterious weakness of the nervous system. She was tired. She was tired in ways that rest alone could not reliably fix, because the conditions producing the tiredness were structural and permanent and waiting for her when she recovered. The women who navigated this best were the ones who had found unofficial outlets. Women who wrote, who painted, who involved themselves in charitable work, who found in the expanding world of Edwardian women's organizations some sense of purpose and agency that the purely domestic and social sphere did not provide. These activities were not always considered entirely respectable. Too much intellectual engagement was itself sometimes categorized as a contributor to nervous trouble in the circular logic that the era applied to women's inner lives. But the women pursued them anyway, because the alternative was simply suffering, politely, which was always an option and never quite enough. Death in the Edwardian era came with its own extensive wardrobe requirements, social calendar, and duration chart. Mourning was not simply sadness. It was a carefully staged public performance of grief, measured in months, calibrated by your relationship to the deceased, and communicated entirely through the specific shade and material of your clothing. Full mourning meant black everything: black dress, black gloves, black veil, black edge stationery, and it lasted approximately a year for a husband, somewhat less for a parent, and a progressively shorter period for increasingly distant relatives, down to the outer reaches of the family tree where a few weeks of muted colours sufficed. The mourning wardrobe was a significant expense, which made grief, in its own peculiar way, a financial event. A widow entering full mourning required an entirely new set of clothes. Her existing wardrobe was by definition the wrong colour and the wrong fabric, since the materials permitted in deep mourning were specific and limited. Crepe, a dull crimped silk fabric that absorbed light rather than reflecting it, producing a peculiarly flat black, was required for the deepest stage and was expensive, fragile, and absolutely non-negotiable. It was also deeply uncomfortable, prone to catching on everything, and notoriously difficult to care for. Wearing it was its own kind of sustained physical endurance. The stages of mourning had names and durations that were charted in etiquette guides with the precision of a timetable. Full mourning was followed by half mourning, during which black could be softened with grey, lavender, or white, colours that communicated that the worst of the grief had passed and the bereaved was returning gradually to the world. Then came ordinary mourning, a further softening, and eventually the resumption of normal dress. Moving through the stages too quickly was considered disrespectful to the deceased and shocking to the community. Moving too slowly suggested an inability to recover that was considered, in its own way, a social problem. Prolonged visible grief was felt to place an uncomfortable burden on everyone around you. The social restrictions that accompanied mourning were as significant as the clothing requirements. A woman in deep mourning did not attend entertainments, no concerts, no dinners, no card parties, no balls. She received visitors and she paid calls, but only within her social circle and only with a solemnity appropriate to her state. She did not laugh loudly. She did not wear jewellery other than jet, the black gemstones specifically associated with mourning, or pieces that had belonged to the deceased and could therefore be worn as a form of memorial. Her stationery was edged in black, the border of which narrowed as the mourning period progressed, so that a careful observer could track the stages of grief through the correspondence. What the mourning system did in practical terms was give everyone around a bereaved woman a clear visual map of where she was in her grief and what was expected of her at any given moment. It removed ambiguity, which was perhaps its genuine function. In a social world deeply uncomfortable with ambiguity of all kinds, a set of rules that told you exactly what to wear and exactly how to behave and exactly when you were permitted to rejoin the normal current of life was, for some women, genuinely useful. For others, it was simply one more performance required at the worst possible time, grief made visible and regulated on someone else's schedule, expressed in someone else's language, according to rules that had been written before you lost anyone, and that could not account for the specific, particular, irreplaceable shape of your own. Being introduced to someone was not simply meeting them. It was a formal ritual with rules about who spoke first, who extended their hand first, who acknowledged, whom, and what the correct expression of polite interest versus active curiosity was allowed to look like on your face. Getting it wrong, introducing yourself rather than waiting to be introduced, or speaking to someone before a formal introduction had been made, was a transgression that could strand you socially for an entire season. Wandering through drawing rooms like a ghost no one was authorized to acknowledge. The hierarchy of introductions was precise and non-negotiable. A person of lower social standing was introduced to a person of higher standing, meaning that the lesser person's name was spoken second, their attention directed toward the more senior party, who had the implicit power to acknowledge or not acknowledge the introduction as they saw fit. A gentleman was always introduced to a lady. Her name was spoken first. She occupied the senior position in the exchange regardless of relative social rank, because the courtesies due to women as women operated on a slightly different axis from those due to social class. The person making the introduction navigated all of this in a single sentence, usually while smiling, while the two parties being introduced stood within a few feet of each other, already aware of the assessment taking place. The handshake was its own small ceremony. A lady offered her hand first. It was her prerogative to extend it or withhold it, and withholding it was a form of cold acknowledgement that communicated a very clear message without a word being spoken. The grip was not firm in the modern sense. That was considered unfeminine and slightly alarming. like being grabbed by someone unexpectedly committed to the interaction. It was a brief, light contact, more of a formal gesture than a physical communication. Gloves were usually still on, which added another layer of physical distance to what was already a highly mediated exchange. Eye contact during an introduction was expected to be present but not intense. You looked at the person being introduced to you with an expression of pleasant interest, not scrutiny, which suggested you were evaluating them, not indifference, which suggested you were not paying attention, but something in between that communicated you were both aware of them and unalarmed by what you were seeing. Holding eye contact for too long crossed into staring. Breaking it too quickly suggested discomfort. The correct duration was somewhere in the middle, and was calibrated instinctively by anyone who had spent enough time in these situations, which is to say that it became natural only after a period of practice, during which it was quite unnervingly difficult. The broader principle operating behind the introduction rules was the idea that social contact was something that had to be formally authorized before it could exist. Two people could be in the same room for an entire evening, could be standing within feet of each other, and would be considered strangers with all the restrictions that implied until a mutual acquaintance had formally brought them together. After that, they were acquaintances, and the interactions available to them expanded accordingly. The introduction was the gate. Until someone opened it, you waited outside, regardless of how much you might have preferred to simply walk in and say hello. That option was not on the table. The gate was the gate, and the gate had rules. Correspondence for an Edwardian woman was not a hobby or an occasional obligation. It was a daily practice requiring dedicated time, the correct stationery, a reliable hand, and the kind of verbal precision that suggested education without intimidation, warmth without excess, and news without gossip, which was a fine line that required constant, exhausting maintenance. The notepaper had to match the occasion. Black bordered paper for mourning, plain cream for general correspondence, monogrammed for anything formal, and the envelope had to be sealed properly, addressed correctly, and dispatched promptly, because a late reply was its own kind of statement. Most well-organized Edwardian households of the middle and upper classes set aside a specific time in the morning for correspondence, typically after breakfast, before the day's social commitments began. A woman might spend 1 to 2 hours at her writing desk each morning, working through the letters that had arrived the previous day and any outstanding obligations from the day before. This was not considered an unusual expenditure of time. It was considered the necessary overhead of maintaining an active social life, which was itself not optional, but a professional requirement for a woman whose primary role was the management and maintenance of her family's social standing. The writing desk was a dedicated piece of furniture, a small, usually elegant structure with a sloped surface, drawers for stationery, and a compartmentalized interior that organized the tools of correspondence into their correct categories: ink, pens, blotter, sealing wax, stamps, and the various grades of notepaper all had their places. A disorganized writing desk suggested a disorganized mind, and since the desk was sometimes visible to callers admitted to the morning room, it was maintained with the same attention to order applied to every other visible surface in the house. The actual writing required a specific skill set that was considered part of a good education. Penmanship was taught seriously and expected to be maintained. A deteriorating hand in adult life suggested either laziness or physical infirmity, neither of which was particularly flattering. The prose style of a letter had to achieve several things simultaneously. It had to be warm enough to communicate genuine feeling, formal enough to respect the conventions of the relationship, informative enough to give the recipient something to respond to, and careful enough to avoid saying anything that could be misread, repeated, or used against you. A letter, once sent, was entirely outside your control. People kept letters. People shared letters. People read old letters aloud years later at moments you had not anticipated, You wrote accordingly. The volume of correspondence expected of an active Edwardian woman was considerable. There were thank you letters after every social engagement, acceptance and regret notes for every invitation, birthday letters for an extended network of family and friends, condolence letters when bereavement struck anyone within social range, and the ongoing maintenance correspondence that kept relationships alive between physical meetings. Add to this the household correspondence, notes to tradespeople, letters to servants in other households, communications with family members at a distance, and the morning writing session was not excessive. It was barely sufficient. The letter was the primary technology of social connection, and a woman who allowed her correspondence to lapse was a woman who was allowing her relationships to lapse, which in the Edwardian social world amounted to the same thing. Sunday service was not simply a religious obligation, it was the week's most heavily attended social performance, a gathering at which everyone saw everyone, noted what everyone was wearing, observed who sat where, and drew conclusions about the moral and financial health of every family in the parish. You arrived on time, which meant early. You dressed appropriately, which meant formally but not showily. Showy was for women who were trying too hard, and trying too hard at church was a particular category of social misstep that people discussed during the walk home. The church hat occupied its own special category of social scrutiny. It had to be present. Attending church, bareheaded, was simply not done, but it could not be so large or so dramatically decorated that it blocked the view of the people seated behind you, which was inconsiderate, or so magnificent that it drew more attention than the proceedings, which was irreverent. The ideal church hat communicated that you had taken care with your appearance, respected the occasion, and had not spent the preceding week thinking about anything quite so worldly as millinery. This was a difficult combination to achieve, and required the same quiet effort that most Edwardian social requirements demanded. Maximum preparation presented as minimum concern. The seating arrangements in an Edwardian parish church were not random. Families had pews, sometimes owned outright, sometimes rented, sometimes simply occupied by long tradition, and sitting in the wrong pew, whether through ignorance or presumption, was an error that produced a specific quality of discomfort in everyone who witnessed it. The family whose pew had been occupied would not make a scene, because making a scene in church was its own category of transgression, but the displacement would be noted, and a quiet word would ensure it did not happen again. Where you sat communicated your family's standing in the parish as clearly as any announcement, and the gradations between the front pews and the back ones were understood by everyone present without ever being formally explained. Behaviour during the service itself was observed with the same quiet attention applied to everything else. You followed the order of service without visible confusion, which meant you were familiar with it, which meant you attended regularly, which communicated something about your household's religious consistency, and therefore its moral fibre. You sang the hymns, not too loudly, which was theatrical, and not inaudibly, which could be read as either shyness or lack of faith, but at a volume suggesting genuine participation by a person of appropriate conviction. You bowed your head at the correct moments. You rose and sat with the congregation in smooth unison, never half a beat behind, which would have suggested your attention had wandered. Children attended and were expected to behave with a stillness that most children found physiologically improbable. The management of children in church was itself a demonstration of household discipline. A child who wriggled, whispered, or dropped a hymnal in the echoing quiet of a Sunday service reflected on its mother in ways that were felt for the rest of the week. Women with young children arrived prepared. Small objects to occupy hands, gentle warnings administered in advance, and a practiced look of serene confidence that suggested everything was entirely under control, even when it was not. After the service came the churchyard social, the informal gathering outside the church doors where the congregation mixed, greetings were exchanged, and the week's social intelligence was quietly distributed. This was where you learned who had been away, who was unwell, who had recently entertained and who had recently been entertained, all conducted in the pleasant, unhurried tones of people who had just spent an hour being reminded of their better natures. It was, in its own way, the most efficient social event of the week, everyone present, everyone visible, and the whole thing accomplished before Sunday lunch. An Edwardian woman of good breeding approached eating with the same energy she brought to every other performance of femininity, carefully, minimally, and with the appearance of someone who found the whole enterprise faintly surprising. Appetite was not a thing to be displayed. You did not pile your plate. You did not take second helpings with enthusiasm. You did not finish everything on your plate, leaving a small amount signal that you had been served sufficiently and were not, God forbid, hungry in a way that might suggest something about your household management. You ate slowly, you chewed quietly, and you never, under any circumstances, discussed the food in terms that implied you had been looking forward to it. The prohibition on visible appetite was one of the more physically challenging requirements of Edwardian womanhood, given that the combination of a tightly laced corset, several petticoats, and a long day of social activity produced a hunger that was entirely legitimate and deeply inconvenient. A woman who ate too little at dinner risked lightheadedness, which could produce the kind of physical drama, swaying, paling, requiring assistance, that attracted exactly the attention she was trying to avoid. A woman who ate too much was considered unrefined. The narrow corridor between these two outcomes had to be navigated at every meal, every day, with no acknowledgement that navigating it required any thought at all. Tea deserved its own paragraph because tea was not a casual affair. Afternoon tea, served between 4 and 5 o'clock, was a formal social event with its own etiquette, entirely distinct from any other meal. The tea itself was poured by the hostess, always the hostess, never a guest, because pouring indicated authority over the table, and that authority was not shared. You accepted the cup with both hands if it was offered without a saucer, with one hand if it came with a saucer, and you did not hold the cup with your little finger extended, which had somehow become associated with refinement, when it was in fact simply an old adaptation to cup handles that no longer applied, but had calcified into a habit that marked you as someone pretending to be more refined than they were. The sandwiches came before the cakes. This was not negotiable. Dining at someone else's table introduced additional requirements on top of the standard ones. You ate what was served without visible reaction to anything you found unexpected, unpleasant, or unidentifiable. Leaving a substantial amount of a dish on your plate could be read as a commentary on its quality, which was an insult to your hostess. Eating everything suggested greed. The small amount left behind was calibrated to communicate satisfaction rather than criticism, and the calibration had to be consistent across courses so that nobody could track a pattern, suggesting you liked some dishes more than others, because having strong food preferences was considered a little too earnest about the whole enterprise. The conversation that accompanied food was subject to its own rules, circling back to the general prohibition on anything too interesting or too honest. You did not comment on the cost of ingredients, even admiringly. You did not ask for recipes in a way that implied you had not eaten this particular dish before, because unfamiliarity with standard dishes of good society suggested a gap in your experience. You could compliment the table, the flowers, the general atmosphere of the meal, the container rather than the contents, and then you put down your fork, left the appropriate small amount, and folded your napkin with the quiet contentment of someone who had eaten just enough of everything and wanted nothing more, which was the performance, and which bore only a passing resemblance to the truth. Every respectable Edwardian woman of the middle or upper classes was expected to possess what were politely called accomplishments. a word that covered a specific set of skills including piano playing, singing, drawing, and perhaps a smattering of French or watercolour painting, all intended to demonstrate that she was cultivated, tasteful, and capable of entertaining a drawing room without professional assistance. These were not skills you necessarily chose. They were skills installed into you during childhood like software that would later be expected to run flawlessly on demand, preferably in front of people who hadn't heard you practice. The piano was the centerpiece of the accomplishment system. A house without a piano was a house making a statement about its social aspirations, and not a flattering one. Every middle and upper-class household had one, every daughter was taught to play it, and the drawing room recital, the informal performance of a piece or two after dinner or during a social call, was a standard feature of Edwardian social life that most participants endured with the resigned good humour of people who knew the rules and had decided, on balance, to comply with them. You played when asked. You did not play badly enough to embarrass your family. You did not play well enough to suggest you had practiced so extensively that it had become a professional aspiration, because professional aspiration was not the point. Amateur accomplishment was the point, and the word amateur contained, in its Edwardian usage, a very specific set of social instructions. Singing accompanied the piano for many women, and the drawing-room song performed standing at the instrument while someone else played, or while you played, and sang simultaneously, had its own repertoire of acceptable pieces, most of them sentimental, melodious, and carefully pitched within a range that would not require you to strain visibly. Straining while singing was inelegant. The voice was supposed to emerge with the same natural ease attributed to every other female accomplishment, even though natural ease in this context meant years of lessons and regular practice conducted in private and never mentioned publicly. Drawing and watercolour painting occupied a similar position in the accomplishment hierarchy, present, demonstrated occasionally, and maintained at a level that communicated taste without ambition. A woman who drew well was admired. A woman who drew professionally was in a more complicated category, not entirely disrespectable by the Edwardian period, since the arts had gradually become a more acceptable avenue for women of talent, but still carrying a faint suggestion that she had needed to, which implied something about her family's financial situation that polite society preferred not to examine directly. The French was perhaps the most genuinely useful of the standard accomplishments, since French remained the lingua franca of European diplomacy, culture, and upper-class social life through the Edwardian period. A woman who could converse in French had a social tool with real practical applications. She could speak with foreign guests, read French literature in its original form, and navigate continental travel without the helpless dependence on translators that marked those who had studied French only on paper. But even French had to be deployed with care. Showing off your French to someone who didn't speak it was unkind, and deploying it in mixed company required the social judgment to know when it was appropriate and when it was simply showing off, and the difference between those two things was, in the Edwardian understanding, entirely a matter of intention and execution. Finding a husband in the Edwardian era was less like falling in love, and more like applying for a position through an extremely formal intermediary while pretending you weren't doing it at all. The social season existed in part as a structured mechanism for getting eligible women and eligible men into the same rooms, often enough that nature, heavily chaperoned and extensively rule-governed nature, might take its course. You did not pursue. You were pursued, but only after signalling availability in the appropriate indirect ways, and only within the correct social circles, because marrying beneath your station was catastrophic, and marrying above it without sufficient cause was suspicious. The London season ran from May to July and represented the concentrated annual effort of the upper and upper middle classes to get their unmarried daughters satisfactorily matched. It was expensive, exhausting, and organised with a military precision that its participants maintained the fiction of finding entirely spontaneous. Balls, garden parties, race meetings, opera evenings, and the full calendar of social events existed partly for their own sake and partly as a delivery mechanism for eligible young people into proximity with each other under conditions controlled enough to prevent anything inappropriate from occurring before the appropriate moment. A young woman making her debut, her formal introduction to society, traditionally marked by presentation at court, entered this system at approximately 18 and was expected to emerge from it, engaged within 1 or 2 seasons, ideally to someone whose financial and social position was at least equivalent to her family's and preferably somewhat superior. Remaining unmarried after 2 or 3 seasons was not a catastrophe, but it was noticed, and the noticing produced a specific kind of social pressure that fell entirely on the woman rather than on the men who had not proposed to her, which says something about the distribution of responsibility in the system that nobody at the time appeared to find particularly remarkable. The courtship itself was conducted under conditions of surveillance so thorough that actual communication between the two parties was remarkably limited. You dance with a man twice at most in a single evening, because dancing with someone 3 times was a public declaration of serious interest that would be talked about the following morning. You sat near him at dinner if the seating had been arranged to permit it. You walked with him in the garden if the weather allowed, and a chaperone accompanied you at a distance close enough to observe and far enough to allow the illusion of privacy. Within these constraints, you were expected to determine whether you wished to spend the remainder of your life with this person, which was an enormous decision being made on extraordinarily limited information. The proposal, when it came, went first through the woman's father or guardian, a formal request for permission to propose that made the daughter's consent feel, in some framings, like an administrative detail following an agreement already, reached between 2 men. A well-raised woman gave her answer promptly and without excessive deliberation, because hesitating too long suggested either that she was weighing other offers, presumptuous, or that she lacked the decisiveness considered appropriate in matters of this kind. Once engaged, the couple were permitted rather more contact than they had been allowed during courtship, which had the quality of a reward that highlighted how restricted everything before it had been. Engagement was the finish line, marriage was what came after, and after marriage, an entirely new set of rules began. By 10 or 11 at night, after the dinner had been survived, the conversation had been managed, the thank-yous had been mentally composed, and the last of the evening's guests had departed with the correct degree of warmth. The Edwardian woman was finally, briefly, partially, allowed to stop performing. The lady's maid returned. The corset was unlaced, the hair came down, the hat was returned to its stand. And somewhere between the removal of the 3rd petticoat and the extinguishing of the lamp, there was perhaps a single quiet moment in which a woman could exist without being observed, measured, or judged, a moment so rare in the Edwardian day that it must have felt each night like briefly surfacing for air. The unlacing of the corset was a physical event significant enough to deserve its own paragraph. After 16 hours of compression, the release of the laces produced a physical sensation that contemporary accounts describe as initially strange. The body had spent so long constrained that the sudden restoration of its natural dimensions required a moment of adjustment. Breathing deepened, shoulders dropped. The particular kind of tension that came from being held in a specific shape all day released itself slowly, like a rope being unwound rather than cut. The woman who emerged from the evening's final undressing was physically a slightly different shape from the one who had been assembled that morning, and for the hours between unlacing and the following morning's relacing, she occupied that shape freely, in the privacy of her own bedroom with nobody watching. The hair came down next, unpinned by the lady's maid with the practiced efficiency that characterized every part of the dressing and undressing ritual. The elaborate construction of the Edwardian upswept style, pads, pins, false pieces, and the combined architecture of an hour's careful work collapsed into whatever the woman's natural hair actually was, which could be quite different from the social presentation that had sat atop it all day. Some women had extraordinary quantities of natural hair. Others had rather less than the fashionable silhouette suggested, the difference being made up by the hair pieces that the era's wig makers and hairdressers supplied as a matter of course. In the privacy of the bedroom, the gap between the public self and the private one was simply and quietly visible. What an Edwardian woman did with her private evening hours depended significantly on who she was and what she was permitted or permitted herself. Reading was common. The Edwardian period was a rich one for literature, and a woman alone in her room with a novel was engaged in something that the era considered acceptable and even mildly improving. Writing in a diary or journal was private enough to allow more honesty than any public communication permitted. Some women used the late evening hours for the correspondence they needed to think about carefully before committing to paper, letters to close friends or family members where more genuine feeling could be expressed than the formal daytime letter allowed. The sleeping arrangements of the Edwardian household offered one final privacy. Married couples of the upper and upper middle classes typically maintained separate bedrooms, connected by a dressing room, which meant that the bedroom itself was genuinely a private space in a way that few other rooms in the house were. No callers, no staff except the lady's maid at the beginning and end of the day, no social obligations operating between the door closing and the door opening again in the morning. It was, in the full 16-hour performance of Edwardian womanhood, the intermission, too short, always too short, but real. You had been corseted, pinned, gloved, evaluated, and found either acceptable or wanting all day long. Now, for a few hours, you were simply a person lying in a quiet room, breathing as deeply as you liked, belonging entirely to yourself. Morning would come soon enough. It always did. The ballroom was the most glittering arena in the Edwardian social world, and it was also one of the most heavily regulated. Dancing was one of the few contexts in which a young woman could be in relatively close physical proximity to a man who was not a family member, which meant that every aspect of the ballroom experience who you danced with, how many times, in what order, and what your face did during it, was governed by rules designed to prevent that proximity from meaning anything it was not supposed to mean. The dance floor was a place of carefully managed excitement, which is perhaps the most Edwardian description of anything that has ever existed. The dance card was the mechanism by which the evening's choreography was organised. A small, decorative card attached to the wrist by a silk ribbon. It listed the dances of the evening in sequence, with a blank space beside each one where a partner's name could be written in pencil. Gentlemen approached young women early in the evening to request dances. The woman or her chaperone assessed the request and the name was entered into the appropriate slot. A fully completed dance card was a social triumph. It meant you were sought after, that your company was desired, that the evening ahead held no embarrassing gaps of wallflower visibility. An incomplete dance card was managed with cheerful composure and a great deal of interior feeling. The twice with the same partner rule operated as both a protection and a communication system. Dancing once with someone was polite and unremarkable. Dancing twice suggested genuine interest, and the second dance was therefore a small declaration that both parties understood, as did everyone who noticed, and people always noticed. Dancing a third time was a public statement of romantic intent so unambiguous that it could generate a formal conversation between families within the week. You managed your dance card accordingly, balancing the genuine desire to spend time with people you liked against the social consequences of being seen to do so too visibly. The waltz occupied a special position in the ballroom hierarchy because it involved the gentleman placing his hand at the lady's waist, a contact so intimate by Edwardian standards that the waltz had been considered scandalous within living memory and still carried a faint charge of daring that made it the most anticipated dance of the evening. The correct waltz posture maintained a specific distance between partners that preserved both propriety and the ability to actually dance, and a gentleman who held his partner too closely was a gentleman making a statement that she was not obliged to receive graciously, and her chaperone was entirely within rights to interrupt. Sitting out a dance required management. If you were not dancing, you sat with your chaperone or a group of other women and maintained an expression of pleasant contentment, suggesting you had chosen to rest and were enjoying the view rather than waiting to be asked, which was the truth, but not the presentation required. You did not look at the dance floor with visible longing. You did not track the movements of any particular person with your eyes. You conversed, you smiled, and you gave the performance of a woman whose evening was entirely satisfactory regardless of what was or was not written on her dance card. At the end of the evening, the final dance was called, and it carried its own significance. Being asked for the last dance of the night was a mark of particular favour, and the gentleman who requested it was making himself known in a way that would be discussed at breakfast the following morning. The ballroom gave and the ballroom took away, and everyone who entered it understood that the dancing was only partly the point. Shopping in the Edwardian era was not the private, anonymous transaction it can be today. It was a social activity, a public appearance, and a performance of financial judgment, all conducted simultaneously on the high street, in the presence of shopkeepers who knew your family, acquaintances who would notice what you bought, and a broader social audience that formed opinions about a woman's household management based on where she shopped and what she purchased. You did not simply buy things, you demonstrated through your purchasing choices the quality of your domestic judgment and the soundness of your family's financial stewardship. The department store was a relatively new phenomenon in the Edwardian era, and it had changed the experience of shopping for middle and upper-class women in ways that were still being absorbed. Places like Harrods and Liberty in London offered a respectable, enclosed environment where women could move through multiple departments without the repeated entry and exit of individual shops, could be served by trained assistants rather than proprietors who knew their business personally and could spend considerable time browsing without any obligation to purchase. This last feature was genuinely revolutionary. The freedom to look without buying, to price without committing, was a liberty that the individual shop had rarely extended and that the department store quietly normalized. The correct approach to a shop assistant communicated social information. A woman who was too deferential to assistants suggested she was unaccustomed to being served, which implied a domestic history that did not include regular commerce in good establishments. A woman who was dismissive or rude suggested poor character, which reflected on her household regardless of its financial standing. The correct register was pleasant, clear, and calm. The tone of someone who understood the transaction, respected the assistance being offered, and had no need to establish superiority through manner because her position was already evident from her clothes, her address, and the quality of her requirements. The question of money was managed with the same careful indirection applied everywhere else. You did not gasp at prices in either direction. You did not ask whether a reduced price was available in the hearing of other customers, because bargaining in public suggested financial pressure, and financial pressure was private. Accounts were maintained with established shops. You charged rather than paid cash in many cases, the bill arriving monthly and settled by the household rather than by the woman herself in the moment, which preserved the fiction that the financial mechanics of the transaction were handled elsewhere by someone else, even if both parties knew perfectly well that the woman standing at the counter was aware of exactly what the account balance was. What you bought communicated as much as how you bought it. Ostentatious purchases, things that were clearly more expensive than your household's position required, suggested either nouveau riche ambition or a dangerous indifference to prudence. Underpurchasing, skimping visibly on quality, choosing the cheaper option when the better one was clearly appropriate, suggested either financial difficulty or a stinginess that reflected poorly on the household's willingness to maintain appearances. The ideal was to purchase exactly what your position required, at exactly the quality that position warranted, with the serene assurance of someone who had never needed to think about it, even though you had been thinking about it quite carefully for some time. Thrift was a virtue. Visible thrift was an embarrassment. The difference was entirely a matter of whether anyone could tell. No aspect of the Edwardian household was more consuming of a woman's time, energy, and diplomatic skill than the management of servants, and no aspect was more thoroughly concealed behind the appearance of effortless domestic order. A well-run Edwardian household was supposed to seem to run itself. Meals appeared, fires were lit, rooms were cleaned, laundry was managed, callers were received, and the whole machinery of domestic life operated smoothly and invisibly, as though the house were simply in a perpetual state of readiness that had nothing to do with the sustained organizational effort of the woman overseeing it. The servant hierarchy in a middle or upper-class Edwardian household was specific and had to be managed with an understanding of its internal politics that rivaled anything happening in the drawing room upstairs. A cook who felt undervalued would leave, and replacing a good cook was both expensive and time-consuming. A lady's maid who was not treated with the particular form of consideration her position required, neither as an equal nor as a lower domestic, but as something in a carefully defined category of her own, would become difficult or give notice. A housemaid who was asked to perform duties outside her stated role without acknowledgement or additional compensation would begin looking for a better situation, which she would likely find because the demand for good domestic staff consistently outran the supply. The mistress of the house conducted the management of this system through daily rituals that were themselves formalized. The morning interview with the cook was a standard feature of a well-run household, a brief business-like conversation about the day's menus, the state of provisions, and any requirements the kitchen had that needed addressing. You did not suggest this meeting suggested you did not trust the cook's judgment. You framed it as consultation rather than oversight, collaboration rather than direction, even though the direction was entirely yours and both parties knew it. It was management conducted in the language of partnership, because the alternative language produced resignation letters. The rules governing how a mistress addressed her servants carried their own etiquette, entirely separate from the rules governing how she addressed her social equals. You used surnames for most staff, Cook, not Mrs. Henderson, Smith, not Emily. You did not share personal information with servants beyond what was operationally necessary, because familiarity dissolved the professional distance that the system required to function. You did not apologize to servants for the demands you made of them, because apologizing implied those demands were unreasonable, and a mistress who suggested her own household requirements were unreasonable had undermined her own authority in a way that was difficult to recover. What the era persistently declined to acknowledge was that household management was skilled work, organizational, diplomatic, financial, and logistical all at once, being performed by women who received no formal credit for performing it and were expected to make it invisible by doing it well. The paradox was complete and perfectly sealed. A household that ran smoothly was evidence that its mistress had nothing particularly difficult to do, and a household that ran badly was evidence that its mistress had failed. The work disappeared when it succeeded and became visible only when it didn't, which is one of the more elegant traps the era devised for the women living inside it. By the early 1900s, something was stirring underneath the surface of the Edwardian social world, something that the etiquette guides and drawing room conventions had not yet caught up with and were not entirely sure how to address. She was called the New Woman, and she was not a single person, but a gathering force, educated, increasingly employed, politically aware, and quietly, persistently done with a significant number of the rules we have spent this entire script describing. She rode bicycles, she attended university, she had opinions about legislation, and she expressed those opinions in public, in print, and occasionally in the street, which was the part that made everyone the most uncomfortable. The bicycle deserves more credit than it typically receives in the history of women's liberation, because the bicycle was a genuinely revolutionary object in the lives of Edwardian women, and it arrived disguised as a leisure item. A woman on a bicycle was a woman moving independently through the world at a speed that outpaced the chaperone system, covering distances that made close supervision logistically impractical, and doing so in clothing that had to be modified to permit the activity. Rational dress reformers had been arguing for years that women's clothing was physically restrictive to the point of harm. The bicycle made the argument practical rather than theoretical. You could not ride a bicycle effectively in full Edwardian skirts, and enough women wanted to ride bicycles that the clothing eventually shifted, at least partially, to accommodate them. The women's suffrage movement was the most visible manifestation of the New Woman's politics, and it split Edwardian society along lines that cut across class, family and friendship in ways that the era's social rules had not been designed to manage. A woman who supported suffrage was, in the view of those who opposed it, stepping outside the role that her gender required her to occupy, not just voting, which she did not yet legally do, but demanding, organising, marching, and in the case of the more militant wing of the movement, breaking windows, chaining herself to railings, and going on hunger strike in prison. These were not activities compatible with the rules about walking at a measured pace and sitting at the front of the chair. The social penalties for being perceived as a new woman varied by context and degree. A woman who read serious books and had formed views about politics, but expressed those views only in trusted private company, was managing the transition carefully. A woman who attended public meetings, signed petitions, or, most extremely, participated in public demonstrations, had moved beyond the boundary of what the social world she lived in could accommodate without comment. The comment was not always hostile. The Edwardian era contained significant numbers of men and women who were sympathetic to reform, who found the new woman interesting rather than alarming, and who recognized that the world was changing in ways that the old rules could not indefinitely contain. What the new woman represented at her core was the beginning of the end of the social system this script has been describing. Not immediately, the rules did not dissolve overnight, and many of them lingered in modified forms for decades. But the Edwardian era contained within it the seeds of its own transformation. Women who'd been educated enough to see the rules clearly, who had the language to articulate what the rules cost them, and who had, in some cases, simply decided that the cost was too high. The corset would loosen, the chaperone would disappear, the calling card would become a relic. The new woman knew it was coming. She was, in many ways, the reason it did. After everything, the corsets and the calling cards, the gloves and the dinner forks, the thank you letters and the mourning calls, the chaperones and the mourning wardrobes and the precise choreography of being introduced to someone at a party, it is worth pausing in the quiet of the evening to ask what all of it was actually for, not what the etiquette guide said it was for, which was civilization, refinement, and the maintenance of a social order that benefited everyone within it. But what it was really for, underneath the lace and the rules and the performance of effortless grace that cost an enormous amount of effort to maintain every single day. The rules were, in large part, a sorting mechanism. They separated the people who knew them from the people who did not, and that separation was the point. A woman who arrived at a morning call at the wrong time, who bent the wrong corner of her card, who wore afternoon gloves to an evening event or left her fan on the dinner table, or expressed visible enthusiasm for the soup, that woman had revealed something about her background, her education, and the circles she had previously moved in. The rules were not arbitrary. They were arbitrary in their specifics and precise in their function, which was to make social class visible through behaviour in ways that could not be easily faked without extensive prior exposure to the environment being faked. This had consequences that extended far beyond dinner party seating. A woman's social position determined who she could marry, where her children would be educated, what circles would be available to them, and what kind of life they would be able to build. The rules were the gatekeeping mechanism for all of that, administered not by any formal authority, but by the collective social judgment of everyone in the room, operating simultaneously and largely without discussion. Getting the rules right meant access. Getting them wrong meant exclusion, sometimes temporary and recoverable, sometimes permanent and final. But the rules were also, in a stranger and more human way, a form of shared language. The women who had grown up inside the system, who had absorbed the rules so thoroughly that they operated without conscious thought, were participants in a common culture with its own grammar and vocabulary and set of references that connected them to each other across geographical distance and social occasion. The morning call and the thank you letter and the dance card were rituals, and rituals create belonging, a sense of shared participation in something that matters, even if what it matters to is the social order rather than anything more transcendent. The Edwardian woman who followed all the rules and followed them correctly was, in the terms her era offered her, doing her job well. She was maintaining her household's reputation, protecting her family's social position, creating an environment in which her children could thrive, and navigating a world that offered her very limited formal power with the tools that were available to her. That those tools were exhausting, physically constraining, and built on assumptions about women's capacities and roles that were already beginning to crumble is also true. Both things were true at once. The rules were a cage and a home simultaneously, and the women inside them were simultaneously constrained and skilled, limited and capable, performing and genuine. History has a tendency to flatten people into one thing. The Edwardian woman was never one thing. She was all of it, every day in a corset with perfect posture, leaving exactly the right amount on her plate. If the ballroom was the Edwardian social world at its most formal, the garden party was its attempt at relaxation, which is to say, it was equally rule-governed but conducted outdoors with sandwiches and the persistent English possibility of rain. The garden party occupied a specific position in the social calendar as an afternoon event that was simultaneously more casual than a dinner and more elaborate than a morning call, which meant it required its own dress code, its own behavioural conventions, and its own specific set of ways to get things wrong that were entirely different from the ways available to you in every other social context. The hat was larger, the gloves were lighter, the stakes were identical. The invitation itself established the social register of what you were attending. A garden party given by a family of significant standing was an event that required as much preparation as a formal dinner, the dress considered, the accessories coordinated, the arrival time calculated. You did not arrive at the beginning, which suggested eagerness, nor at the end, which suggested you had somewhere more important to be first. You arrived somewhere in the comfortable middle of the stated hours, moved through the assembled guests with the pleasant, unhurried manner of someone who had been to enough garden parties to find them unremarkable, and proceeded to find them entirely remarkable, while giving no indication that you did. The lawn itself was a social chessboard. Where you stood, who you were seen speaking to, how long you remained in any given conversation, all of it was visible in a way that the enclosed rooms of a house did not quite replicate. Outdoors, there were no corners to retreat to, no convenient doorways to stand beside, no architectural features providing the illusion of privacy. You were simply on a lawn, in full daylight, surrounded by people who could see you from any direction, which concentrated the social performance into something almost athletic. You moved through the space with purpose, managing your trajectory so that you passed near people you needed to greet without appearing to have aimed for them. The food at a garden party was its own small pleasure, which the rules required you to enjoy with appropriate moderation. Cucumber sandwiches, small cakes, fruit, and iced beverages circulated on trays carried by staff, and the etiquette of accepting them without interrupting your conversation, taking something from a tray while continuing to speak, managing a cup and a small plate while standing on a lawn, in a long skirt and long gloves, was a physical coordination challenge that nobody acknowledged as a challenge, because acknowledging it would have required admitting that standing on a lawn, eating a sandwich in formal dress was not entirely natural. Rain was the garden party's perpetual antagonist, and the English weather's willingness to produce it at any moment added a specific kind of tension to the afternoon that was never quite discussed but always present. A hostess whose garden party was rained out had not failed exactly, but the sudden migration of 50 formally dressed guests into a house that had not been fully arranged to receive them produced a compressed, slightly chaotic version of indoor entertaining that required immediate improvisation. Guests managed this with a cheerful adaptability considered appropriate in the face of circumstances beyond anyone's control, which was itself a social skill, the ability to treat mild disruption as a charming incident rather than a problem. By the time the afternoon drew to its close and the carriages were called, you had stood for several hours, eaten carefully, conversed continuously, navigated the full visible social space of someone's lawn, and done all of it, while dressed as though for a formal occasion, and maintaining throughout the pleasant expression of a woman who had found the afternoon entirely delightful, which, in its own particular way, you perhaps had. Beneath every Edwardian social interaction, involving unmarried women and eligible men, beneath the dance cards and the morning calls and the carefully calibrated drawing room conversations, ran a financial current so powerful and so constant that the entire social season could be understood as an elaborate mechanism for its management. Marriage in the Edwardian era was a financial transaction of the most consequential kind, and everyone involved in it, the women, their families, the men, their families, understood this with a clarity that the social rules required them to never directly acknowledge. The money was the point, the romance was the presentation, and separating the two in practice was something nobody actually managed, though everyone maintained the appearance of attempting it. A woman without money needed a husband who had some. This was not a cruel observation. It was a structural reality of a world in which women could not inherit equally, could not enter most professions, could not manage property independently in many cases, and had no reliable mechanism for financial security other than the man they married. The pressure to marry well was therefore not vanity or ambition in its simple forms. It was survival mathematics, conducted in ballrooms while wearing white and pretending to think about something else entirely. A woman who married badly, a charming man with no income, a pleasant companion with encumbered estates, had made a decision whose consequences would extend across the remainder of her life, and quite possibly into the lives of her children. The negotiation of marriage settlements happened between fathers, solicitors, and occasionally mothers operating at the edge of their formal authority, in rooms to which the women most directly affected were not admitted. The settlement determined what income the wife would have if she was widowed, what happened to her own money or property if she brought any into the marriage, and what financial provisions would be made for the children. These were not romantic conversations, which is presumably why they were conducted by other people in separate rooms. preserving the fiction that the marriage itself was a matter of feeling rather than finance. What was particularly vertiginous about the system was that it required women to be simultaneously ignorant and entirely aware. A woman was not supposed to be seen to marry for money, that was mercenary, which was one of the more serious charges available in the Edwardian moral vocabulary. She was supposed to marry for feeling, for compatibility, for the genuine warmth she'd developed for a person over the course of a heavily supervised courtship conducted in 15-minute intervals. At the same time, she and her family needed to ensure the financial basis of the marriage was sound, because romantic feeling did not pay household accounts. The women who navigated this most successfully were those who had been honest with themselves about both dimensions simultaneously, who understood that financial security and genuine affection were not opposites, that a sensible choice and an emotional one could occupy the same decision, and that the performance of pure romantic feeling did not require the actual absence of practical thought. They married people they could live with, in circumstances they could sustain, and they did so inside a social system that required them to pretend the calculation had never happened. Some of them were happy, some of them were comfortable, some of them were both, and some of them were neither, and the social rules provided no vocabulary for the difference, which is perhaps the thing that the rules, for all their elaborateness, most conspicuously failed to address. The Edwardian era ended not gradually, but with the abruptness of a door slamming. On the 22nd of January 1901, Queen Victoria died after 63 years on the throne, and the Victorian age she had defined so thoroughly was officially over. Edward VII, her son, gave his name to the decade that followed, and the Edwardian period that is the subject of this entire script lasted, in its strictest definition, only until 1910, when Edward himself died, and George V inherited a world that was already accelerating toward changes that none of the etiquette guides or morning call conventions had been designed to accommodate. What followed, within a few years, was a war so total and so transforming that the social world we have been describing was simply not there when it ended. The First World War, which began in 1914, did not merely interrupt the Edwardian social calendar, it demolished the infrastructure that supported it. The servant class that had made possible the elaborate domestic machinery of the upper and middle class household was depleted by the war. Men went to fight, and women who had been in domestic service found wartime employment in factories, hospitals, and offices that paid better and came without the restrictions of the servant's position. When the war ended, they did not return in the same numbers to the same roles, and the households that had required 8 or 10 servants to operate correctly found themselves managing with 3 or 2, or simply differently. The morning call system that required free afternoons and the infrastructure of calling cards and receiving days depended on a domestic economy that was quietly ceasing to exist. The women who had spent the years before 1914 performing the full Edwardian social repertoire, the correct curtsy, the precisely timed morning call, the layered morning wardrobe, the dance card managed to the second dance with any one partner, spent the war years doing things the etiquette guides had no category for. They drove ambulances and staffed hospitals. They managed family finances alone because their husbands were away or gone. They worked in roles that required them to be competent, decisive, and publicly visible in ways that the drawing room had not prepared them for and that the drawing room's rules would not have permitted. And they were competent and decisive and publicly visible, and the world noted this with a mixture of gratitude and a dawning recognition that the before-the-war assumptions about what women could and could not manage had perhaps been somewhat conservative in their assessment. The 1920s that followed were not the Edwardian era with minor modifications. They were a different world, shorter skirts, absent corsets, Women voting, women working, women moving through public space without chaperones and without the elaborate signalling system of fans and calling cards and precisely folded envelope corners. The rules did not disappear entirely. Social conventions of all kinds are more durable than the circumstances that created them, and echoes of the Edwardian etiquette system persisted in formal social contexts for decades. But the comprehensive, totalizing system, the one that governed every hour of every day from the morning assembly to the nightly unlacing, was gone. What remained was something more durable than any of the specific rules, the evidence that the women who had lived inside the system had been, all along, considerably more capable than the system assumed. They had managed its requirements with skill, adapted to its contradictions with intelligence, and when the world changed around them, they changed with it, without hesitation, without apparent difficulty, and without particularly waiting to be told that they were allowed to. The corset was gone. The women were still there. They always had been. And so here we are, at the end of a very long day in the Edwardian era. You've been laced into a corset before breakfast, assembled by a lady's maid who arrived before you were properly awake, and sent out into the world wearing a hat the size of a small weather system, secured to your head with something that was technically a weapon. You have navigated the morning call, managed the calling card, survived the dinner table, composed the thank you letter, endured the chaperone, performed the accomplishments, and made it through an entire social season without once bending the wrong corner of an envelope or sitting at the back of a chair. You've done all of this in the correct dress for the correct hour, with the correct expression on your face, at the correct measured pace, while internally composing your correspondence and monitoring the room for conversational hazards. It was by any honest measure an extraordinary amount of work. But here's what the rules never quite managed to contain, despite their best efforts: the intelligence of the women living inside them, the wit that found its way into the letters, the warmth that persisted through every formally mediated introduction, the quiet, stubborn determination that eventually outgrew the system entirely and walked out the other side of it into a different world, still upright, still composed, still capable of writing a thank you letter of impeccable warmth and timing, but breathing, finally and fully, without anyone deciding how deeply. Tonight, as you sink into your bed without a corset, without a calling card, and without a single rule about which fork comes next, maybe spare a quiet thought for the Edwardian woman who got through her day correctly, and then got through her era, and then got through the wall on the other side of it. She earned the rest. Sleep well.